The Russian military and its army especially were not particularly large. They discovered that we had poured billions of dollars in terms of training and equipment into this Ukrainian force. And their concern was that at some point we would put missiles into eastern Ukraine that could threaten Russian cities and ultimately Russia's nuclear deterrent. That's why they went in. They also went in because the Russian people that live in eastern Ukraine, and I would say that more than half of the people living in eastern Ukraine are Russians who speak Russian, are culturally Russian, ethnically Russian, were being treated as second-class citizens. In fact, I would go even further and say probably third-class citizens. They were actively oppressed and mistreated and brutalized. All of this brought about the current crisis in the war. And once the war began and it became clear that we had invested very heavily in this Ukrainian force and that we were prepared to effectively provide limitless support in terms of equipment, resources, advice, and access to high technology to the Ukrainians, the Russians made a decision to effectively go over to the defensive until they had built a force large enough and powerful enough to defeat the enemy. That has now happened. The Ukrainians are defeated. And there is no chance for Ukraine to win this conflict. It's over.
Let's take a moment to unpack what Colonel Macgregor just said, because the implications of his words reach far beyond the headlines we're accustomed to seeing. What's often missed in Western media is the real historical and geopolitical context that led to this devastating war. First, let's start with the size and strategy of the Russian military. As Macgregor pointed out, Russia's military wasn't particularly large when this conflict started. For years, Western observers have emphasized Russia's vast nuclear arsenal, but that doesn't mean the Russians were prepared for a large-scale land war. In fact, Russia's military posture had been more about defense and deterrence, particularly in terms of its nuclear capabilities. However, the significant buildup of Ukrainian forces, with Western support, training, and billions of dollars in military aid, became a serious concern for Moscow. Now, we need to ask why this was so concerning to Russia. The answer lies in geography. If missiles were stationed in eastern Ukraine, they could reach Russian cities in minutes. More importantly, these missiles would have the capability to undermine Russia's nuclear deterrent, which is the cornerstone of its defense strategy. Without this deterrent, Russia would be vulnerable to attacks from the West. This isn't a theoretical issue. Russia has a long history of defending itself from invasion, and this threat loomed large. But this isn't just about missiles or military hardware. Macgregor mentions another critical factor, the plight of ethnic Russians living in eastern Ukraine. These people, who share Russian language, culture, and heritage, were increasingly marginalized after 2014 when the Ukrainian government moved closer to the West. Many were treated as third-class citizens, as Macgregor said, actively oppressed, mistreated, and brutalized. Let's delve deeper into what happened in 2014, because this is where the seeds of today's conflict were planted. After the Maidan uprising, Ukraine underwent a radical political shift. The pro-Russian government of Viktor Yanukovych was overthrown, and a pro-Western regime came to power. While this was celebrated in much of the West as a victory for democracy, it had a very different meaning for Russia and for ethnic Russians in Ukraine. The new Ukrainian government adopted policies that many ethnic Russians in Ukraine saw as hostile. Russian was downgraded as an official language, and there were efforts to promote a stronger Ukrainian national identity, often at the expense of ethnic Russians. Protests erupted in eastern Ukraine, especially in the Donbas region, which is home to a significant Russian-speaking population. These protests escalated into a violent conflict that has never really ended. For Moscow, the situation in eastern Ukraine was a clear sign that Ukraine was slipping further away from Russia's sphere of influence and becoming a tool for the West to contain Russia. It wasn't just about protecting ethnic Russians in Ukraine. It was about preventing Ukraine from becoming a forward operating base for NATO forces, armed with missiles and other advanced weapon systems. Let's zoom out even further and think about NATO's expansion over the past few decades. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, many people thought the Cold War was over. But what followed was the steady eastward expansion of NATO. Country after country in Eastern Europe joined the alliance, bringing NATO forces closer and closer to Russia's borders. From Russia's perspective, this was a clear threat. Imagine if Russia were to station troops and missiles in Canada or Mexico. The United States would understandably see that as an existential threat and respond aggressively. This is exactly how Moscow views NATO's expansion, and Ukraine's shift toward the West was the final straw. This is why, in 2014, Russia annexed Crimea and supported separatists in the Donbass region. They saw it as a necessary move to protect Russian citizens and secure their strategic interests. Fast forward to 2022, and the situation escalates even further. Russia's military intervention was framed by Western media as an unprovoked invasion. But from Moscow's perspective, it was a defensive action, an attempt to stop what they saw as an existential threat to their nation. Now, as Macgregor emphasized, once the war began, it quickly became clear that the West had invested heavily in Ukraine's military capabilities. Billions of dollars in weapons, equipment, and training poured into Ukraine from the United States and its NATO allies. High-tech systems, including intelligence-sharing platforms and advanced weaponry, allowed Ukraine to put up a strong resistance early on. But as the war dragged on, it became increasingly obvious that this was not going to be a short conflict. The Russians adapted. They shifted their strategy, going into a defensive posture while they built up a larger and more capable force. According to Macgregor, that phase is over now. The Russians have reportedly built a force large enough to decisively defeat Ukraine's military, and from his perspective, the outcome of the war is already determined. Ukraine is defeated, and there's no chance for them to win. This assessment is sobering. It's not something you'll hear in mainstream media, where the narrative often focuses on Ukraine's heroic resistance and Russia's supposed weaknesses. But Macgregor's analysis challenges this view. He argues that the war is essentially over, and it's only a matter of time before Ukraine is forced to negotiate terms that will likely be dictated by Russia. If Macgregor is correct, what does this mean for Ukraine, for Europe, and for the world? First and foremost, it's a tragedy for the Ukrainian people. Cities have been reduced to rubble, millions have fled, and hundreds of thousands of lives have been lost. Ukraine, once seen as a potential success story for the West's strategy in Eastern Europe, is now a devastated country with an uncertain future. For Europe, the consequences are also dire. Energy prices have skyrocketed as Europe has cut itself off from Russian gas. Economies across the continent are struggling with inflation, political instability, and social unrest. And let's not forget the refugee crisis, which has placed enormous pressure on European nations already grappling with their own domestic challenges. And what about the United States? Many Americans don't realize just how much this war has cost them. Billions of taxpayer dollars have been funneled into Ukraine, while domestic problems like infrastructure decay, healthcare, and education remain underfunded. The U.S. government has essentially tied its foreign policy to a conflict that, according to Macgregor, is unwinnable. The war may be drawing to a close in Ukraine, but the ripple effects will be felt for years to come. So, where do we go from here? If Ukraine's defeat is inevitable, as Macgregor suggests, what's the next step for the West? Will there be a push for peace talks, or will the conflict continue to drag on, costing more lives and resources? One thing is clear, the current strategy has failed. The war has been a disaster for Ukraine, a disaster for Europe, and a disaster for U.S. foreign policy. And as we move forward, we need to take a hard look at the decisions that led us to this point and learn from our mistakes. Thank you for watching, and remember, stay informed, question the narrative, and think critically. According to Douglas Macgregor, the Russian military and its army especially were not particularly large. They discovered that we had poured billions of dollars in terms of training and equipment into this Ukrainian force, and their concern was that at some point, we would put missiles into eastern Ukraine that could threaten Russian cities and ultimately Russia's nuclear deterrent. That's why they went in. They also went in because the Russian people that live in eastern Ukraine, and I would say that more than half of the people living in eastern Ukraine are Russians who speak Russian, are culturally Russian, ethnically Russian, were being treated as second-class citizens. In fact, I would go even further and say probably third-class citizens. They were actively oppressed, mistreated, and brutalized. All of this brought about the current crisis in the war. Thanks for watching.